argument is, well, gee, the Antarctic ice cap is melting. And if all that ice melts, sea level is going to rise and we're all going to drown in the coastal areas. So the question is the Antarctic ice cap melting or not? And the answer is actually no, it isn't. Okay, one more. Oh, okay, this will work. Well, no, go one more. There we go. Antarctica has a huge ice sheet, which is about 15,000 feet in this area here. It has a peninsula that sticks out as an arm into the sea. And we have stations here, weather stations, that's the next one, that show that the ice in the Antarctic ice cap is actually increasing, not decreasing. It's not melting at all. Blue here means colder. It's getting colder at the North Pole, not warmer. And here's the proof. This is a record of the last 50 years from 2 stations at the South Pole that show that there's been absolutely no warming at the South Pole in the last 50 years. But yet we're hearing that the whole ice cap is going to melt and raise sea level, and it's going to raise havoc in the coastal areas. Next one. On top of that, in order to get ice to melt in the Antarctic, you have a long way to go, because the average annual temperature is 58 degrees below zero. Last winter was 160 degrees below zero at the South Pole. In order to get ice to melt, you have to raise it from minus 58 to 32 degrees. That's 90 degrees. You need another 10 degrees or so to get any appreciable melting to occur. You would have to raise the temperature of the Antarctic ice sheet 100 degrees in order to melt it. Don't think it's going to happen. How about sea level rise? Here is a statement by Gore and by Hansen of sea level rise from anywhere from 20 feet in the next, well, by 2015 was Gore's prediction, and as much as 250 feet by Hansen, who's the guy that runs the NASA climate group. Here's what New York City would look like if you rose sea level only 20 feet. Actually, I kind of like this. I'm an old country boy. Next one. Here's what London would look like if we rose sea level 20 feet. Next one. Here's what Boston would look like. The blue color area here is the present city that would be drowned by rising sea level. Next one. And not only that, they're predicting that storms would be a lot more violent because the sea level is higher and reach farther inland, and we have all kinds of things. This is a cartoonist's portrayal of what might happen. Next one. So what's the reality? The reality is, here's the sea level curve for the last century, and it's climbing slowly as we thaw out from the last little ice age, which is perfectly expectable. It's 0.8 of 1 degree warmer, so as it warms up slowly, we get sea level rise. If you look at how thick your fingernail is, that's about 1 millimeter. Sea level is rising about 2 to 3 millimeters a year. So you'd be hard-pressed to notice how high sea level is getting each year. It was only 1 to 3 fingernails thick. Next one. Here's what's happening in the last decade. This is the 1992. This is sea level rise. These are millimeters over here. Think of these as the thickness of your fingernail on the scale over here. This is the rate that it's rising. And in the last number of years over here on the right-hand side, sea level actually has stopped rising. And yet I hear in the news every day we're having accelerating rise of sea level, and we're going to have to start making plans to abandon cities. Los Angeles, New York, which is again probably not a bad idea, but it isn't going to happen. Next one. Finally, number 9, the IPCC, which is the agency of the UN that's pushing this whole thing, is totally corrupt. It fakes data, it produces fraudulent reports, and it suppresses debate. And I'll show you a few examples of exactly what they've done. So this is not my opinion. I'll show you why this statement is on here. There was a release of several thousand emails by someone who is still unknown that showed the degree of corruption and collusion between the IPCC leaders who were conspiring with one another to hide changes that they didn't like in the global warming picture. And they did the things that you see over here listed on the site. I'm not going to go through them with you. You can see them. But in essence, what they did was they doctored a lot of data. They did many things that are really totally against what science is supposed to stand for. Next one. Here's one of the things they did, and this is the famous one. This is a so-called hockey stick, where the claim was made that climates have always been the same. They've never changed until CO2 began to rise from human emissions, and that's what's causing global warming. Well, the guy who did this was a professor at Penn State University, and what he did was he made a curve like this with a straight line for climate for the last 1,000 years, and he got to here, and then his curve went down, which was embarrassing. And so, as is pointed out in his emails, he had to hide the decline. And so he erased that and replaced it with something else. Here is the decline down into the Little Ice Age, which was embarrassing. So he erased that. He essentially obliterated the Little Ice Age and the medieval warm period as if they didn't exist, even though there are about 3,000 scientific papers that substantiate it. Next one. Let's skip this one. I've already mentioned that. Here's a case in point. We see this over and over again. This is a case from New Zealand. This is temperature. Up is hotter, down is colder. Blue here is a cooling trend. Red is a heating trend. The actual data is this line right here, the green line and the blue. And so there's been 50 years of cooling in this place in New Zealand. 50 years of cooling. And what they did was they added temperature to this curve in a stepwise fashion like this, until they changed 50 years of global cooling into 10 degrees of global warming per century. Doctoring of data. There it is. Indisputable. Next one. Let's skip this one. It's another example of the same thing. So, what's it really all about? It's all about power and money. It's not about science. And the idea behind the IPCC was that if you scare the hell out of everybody, then you can do all sorts of things, both politically and in terms of money, that you might not otherwise be able to do. For the scientists, what they got for signing on, the ones that did, was essentially unlimited research funds. And this is not trivial, and I'll show you in a minute. The US spends $2.5 billion a year on climate research, which all goes to the global warming CO2 people. I couldn't get a nickel out of that if I tried, because it's totally taken over by the CO2 people. Next one. And here it is, $2.5 billion a year. These are the agencies that it goes to, and almost all of that goes for propaganda. Some of it goes for legitimate research, but precious little of it, the stuff that I read coming out of some of these agencies, is what we call junk science or garbage science. It's not really science at all. Next one. All of this is detailed in a devastating fashion in a new book by Donna Boise, who's an investigative journalist who dug deeply into the IPCC and has documented everything in a book called The Delinquent Teenager, making an analogy between the global warming CO2 people and a delinquent teenager who is misbehaving rather badly. I totally recommend this book if you're interested at all in how corrupt the IPCC is. It's all there, and it's all factual, and it costs about $5 on Amazon. And of course, the IPCC totally ignores all of that and goes blindly on, continuing the same practices, unaware of the effect that this book is having. Next. So the real goal of IPCC is, by their own admission, is reallocation of global wealth and global power. So this is what the IPCC working group has come up with. These are their statements, not mine. You can read them yourself. And in essence, what it is a ploy, a scam if you like, for power and money both. And when I say money, I'm not talking pocket change. We are talking trillions of dollars. The US commitment to this by the group that's doing this would have been $1 trillion over 10 years, $200 billion a year. And the power involved would be to set up a world government which is run by the secretariat, a secretariat in the United Nations, that would have autocratic control over everybody in the world. We would no longer be a sovereign nation. And this is in the draft statement that they drafted in Copenhagen and have been trying to get reaffirmed, or trying to get passed through the international conferences. They're held every year. They're doing this for 3 years. So far, China, Canada, the US, India have balked at it. They won't go for it, although our country did promise to contribute $200 billion a year to this, this particular piece of work. Next one. When you hear Agenda 21, first thing to do is check your wallet. Second thing is to think, how is this going to affect my everyday life? And it will have some big influences. It would set up a world government which is not elected, it's autocratic, there's no accountability. The funding would come from the Western countries, and there would be no accountability. There is no accountability, at least at the present time, to account for any of the funding. And then, next one. A number of other things which boil down to an autocratic government at the world level that would have control over every aspect of our lives. That's the bottom line. And you see Agenda 21, and apparently you're already aware of this, so I won't spend any more time on that, but look out for it. Next one. So what's in store for the next couple of decades? Well, how do guess the colder is going to be, apparently. So in the 1970s, the same people who were now touting global warming were touting global cooling, that we're headed for a little ice age and we're all going to go to hell. We're going to freeze to death. And then they switched. These are the same climate modelers. Said, well, we've got global warming, so we're all going to fry instead. And then when it apparently isn't happening, they're saying, oh, it'll happen yet. It's just lurking under the bed and it's going to leap out and get us as soon as this present cooling passes by. Okay, I'm going to skip through these next ones so we have time for some questions. The reason we know what's going to happen in the next few decades is that our climate is governed by what's called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. That's a big name for it, what's called a PDO. And all it means is that the water off the coast of North America and across the Pacific here is called, blue is cold, as in all these slides. And so it means that the water here is cold, but sometimes the ocean does a switch, on-off kind of switch, and it turns warm, which is the red here, that's the warm. So this is the Pacific Ocean cool phase, this is the warm mode, cold mode. Two modes back and forth, nothing in between apparently. And here's what it comes out to be, that we have 20 or 30 years of global cooling, 20 or 30 years of global warming on a regular basis going back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Next one. And in 1997, we were in the warm mode. We were in what's called the recent global warming. In 1999, look what happened. It switched to cold mode. And it's been that way ever since, and it's that way today. Next one. Here's what it was like last week. Look at that. This guarantees that we're going to have global cooling for probably another 20 to 30 years. This is a pattern that's repeated over and over and over again. Whenever this happens in the past, it doesn't change for 25 years. Next one. Let's skip this for a moment. So what does this mean? It means that we can project into the future the pattern that we've been observing in the past. And what we get is a scenario of global cooling for the next 2 or 3 decades. And this thing is dying. Oh, there we go. Here are my projections for possibilities for the global cooling. It may be very moderate, as it was from 1945 to 77, which was the last cold period of the ocean. It may be similar to 1880, which was more severe. A lot of temperature cold records were set at that time. Or maybe similar to the big one that occurred in about 1800 called the Dalton Minimum. This is what got Napoleon in Russia. Froze 400,000 troops or so. Or it might be even worse and go back to the Little Ice Age. Next one. Let's skip through these. I'm running out of time, so I'll leave time for questions. This is some solar stuff. Let's just keep on going. Next time we'll talk faster. Okay, stop here. The reason that this is important is that the last time we had a cessation of sunspots. These are sunspots here. These are the number of sunspots. The blue dots represent sunspots that were recorded for the period from about 1650 to 1700. And this was an extremely cold period. About a third of the population of Europe either starved to death or died of disease at this time. Terrible, terrible time. Next one. The Thames River froze over, the Baltic Sea froze over. Next one. Let's just cycle through these quickly. This is Greenland, where it drove the people out of Greenland who had settled there during the medieval warm period when you could grow crops and things there, and it froze them out. Next one. Glaciers advanced in Europe, ran over villages, and caused all kinds of problems. Next one. Let's just cycle through these. Let's skip this one. Skip this one. Here's Napoleon. Next one. Next one. Okay, so we have a choice of where we're headed. We might get this, we might get this, we might get this, or we might get the really big one, which is the so-called Maunder mineral, the one that did so much damage from 1650 to 1700. That's where we're headed. I work with a bunch of solar physicists who are convinced that we will at least approach this one right here, which is called the Dalton, the middle blue curve, which would mean it's going to be substantially colder, which has all kinds of implications. Next one. So here's the real problem. If we have global cooling, we're going to have increased energy demand per capita. It takes more energy to keep warm. We have decreased food production because a lot of the wheat belts of the world will shift and no longer be able to grow in the areas where it's grown right now. Here's what's happening in population. At the time of Christ, we had 250 million people. In 1930, we had 2 billion. Remember John Kennedy? Anybody here old enough to remember John Kennedy? 1960, we had 3 billion people. Okay, here's 2000. In 40 years, the population of the US and the world doubled. The population is doubling about every 40 years, which means then that we're now at about roughly almost 7 billion, and the projection is we'll hit 8 billion by 2025 and 9 billion by 2050. I think that's conservative because if you apply a doubling formula to this that's consistent with the past century, you get more like 12 billion. Guess what it's going to be at the turn of the century? It's going to be somewhere around 20 billion people. We're now a little over 6. How are you going to supply enough energy and enough food for that many people? That's the real problem. Global cooling coupled with population expansion. Next one. So, global cooling is a bigger threat than global warming ever was. And it looks like that's where we're headed. Next one. So, I'm going to leave these conclusions up, which you can read at your leisure and hopefully get to some questions. There is out here on the side an interesting exhibit that shows the corruption of the IPCC in the form of emails that were released and made public. So I would strongly urge you to take a look at it to confirm just how corrupt this group is. And also read the book called The Delinquent Teenager. It's a $5 purchase. You will find absolutely amazing. It's all documented in there and in the board out here. So let me close by saying simply, don't throw away your carpet yet. Thanks.
The panels are outside on your way out to look at them, but also they're on our website. So if you go to our website, we have a PDF file that you can download and look at these at your leisure. For the question and answer period, it will be only members that are allowed to ask questions. Raise your hand, stand up when you're called upon, and ask your question. Go ahead. I'll let you choose what you want.
I'm going to be arbitrary and start at the back.
Dr. Easterbrook, thanks for coming today. 4 or 5 years ago when I saw your presentation, at that time there was great challenges in the media of not accepting the ideas and presentations you brought forth. Since that time, have you seen a substantial change in areas that matter, such as in court proceedings or other legislative proceedings that are beginning to recognize and adopt your findings to counterbalance the propaganda we hear out of the IPCC?
That's true. There have been 2 court rulings recently, in the past couple of weeks, that rule